Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Yaki, the director of the LaFollette School of Public Affairs, and I'm delighted to be moderating our event tonight on behalf of the LaFollette School, as well as our co-sponsor, the Elections Research Center at UW-Madison. Before doing so, I wanted to quickly take this opportunity to introduce you to our school. Many of you may already be familiar with the LaFollette School of Public Affairs, which is our home for public policy research and teaching at UW-Madison's campus. The LaFollette School is one of the top policy schools in the world. We educate graduate students in 2 professional master's programs, as well as UW-Madison undergraduate students in our brand new Certificate in Public Policy program. At present, our school is experiencing a lot of growth, doubling the size of our faculty and over doubling the numbers of students that we are serving, all within the last year or so. Part of this growth has been funded by a $10 million investment in the school by former Senator Herb Kohl. We are so thankful for this gift. One of the things that this gift enables is greater dialogue around society's most pressing public policy problems. And given that mandate, I'm thrilled to be introducing our speaker tonight. Maggie Haberman is a White House correspondent who joined the Times in 2015. She's part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for reporting on Donald Trump's advisors and their connections to Russia. The Times describes her as one of their most prominent and prolific reporters. Before joining the Times, Haberman worked as a reporter at Politico. Haberman is our public affairs journalist in residence for fall 2020. Thus, she's going to speak for around 30 or so minutes, and we're going to have some time for Q&A as well. So please join me now in welcoming Maggie Haberman. Maggie?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me tonight. It is an honor to be here. I'm sorry that we can't do this in person. My mother is a Madison alumnus, so I'm very sorry that I didn't get to see the campus, but it's an honor to be here tonight. So let me start. This is obviously a year of profound events. This is an election that is incredibly unusual, taking place in a time of a pandemic that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, and at a time of civil unrest and protests across the country against systemic racism and police brutality. I'm going to talk about all of this, but I want to start out using my time to talk about the profession of journalism, how we have covered President Trump, my 5 colleagues on the White House team and myself, and a White House like no other in our history, and what the future might look like. I can't say what it will look like, but I can tell you what I think it could look like. I have spent the last 4 years covering the White House, most frequently from New York City, where I still live, usually from my phone while in my car driving somewhere in Brooklyn. Let me describe a typical day covering this White House. Most days I file or contribute to at least one story. These days we have live briefings for the election, for the coronavirus, and we feed items, basically like blog items, to those briefings throughout the day. Beginning in the morning through the evening, I am making phone calls, I am texting sources, I am monitoring what's happening at the White House and on the campaign trail. And it has been this way for a while. However, most of my time over the last 7 months has been less about the political climate for the president, other than how he sees it for himself, and primarily about how he has mismanaged and in some cases outright failed to manage the coronavirus pandemic. A few weeks ago, when President Trump tested positive for the coronavirus, it was the most intense time that I had had covering anything since the first days after President Trump won in 2016, and before that, since the days and weeks after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. At the time, I was a reporter at the New York Post, and I was down at ground zero, near ground zero, when the second tower fell. From 1 a.m. on October 2nd this year through 6 days later, I slept maximum 4 hours a night, and I would wake up every hour to check my phone because I needed to make sure there had not been a change in how the president was doing. I did not expect to be where I am today. I didn't expect to be covering the White House. I didn't expect to be covering President Trump. And I did not expect to be doing it for the New York Times or any newspaper. I ended up in journalism by accident. The only thing I had ever wanted to be was a writer, and that's what I went to college to study. My father is a journalist who had worked for decades at the New York Times, and candidly, it was not a lifestyle that I wanted for myself. I knew what it could do in terms of an impact on families. So when I graduated from Sarah Lawrence College in 1996, I tried finding a magazine job thinking it would be a good way to get paid for writing. But I went on one interview after another at magazines and no one would hire me. I ended up taking a job as a clerk at the New York Post in August of 1996, referred to it by a family friend. And I distinctly remember complaining about the work on that first day. It was shuffling papers back and forth from one desk to another. It was, fetching coffee, sorting mail. It was not, to put it mildly, what I had gone to college to do, in my opinion. Others, and I complained to basically anybody who would listen to me. I stayed, however, I didn't have much of a choice since my career prospects were dim, and I watched. I learned, and by the end of that first week there, I had fallen in love with the place, with the rhythms of the newsroom, with the frenetic energy bouncing off the city desk editors. It was simply fantastic to be at a tabloid in New York City in the 1990s. Once a week as a clerk, I was sent out into the city as a general assignment reporter. I was born and raised in New York, but as a reporter in training for a tabloid, I experienced it in a way I never had before. I went to parts of the city I'd never seen. I talked to people I'd never encountered or never would have otherwise. I spoke to a man on the floor of a hospital in a building I had snuck into who had just lost his pregnant wife and one of his children. I unfortunately reached the roommate of a subway pushing victim before the police did, and I delivered the news of her friend's death. I talked to the wife of a bus driver who had skidded off of a highway on a holiday night during a drive to Atlantic City, leaving several people dead. On the advice of a skilled general assignment reporter who I had the privilege of working with, I would scan the eyes of bystanders crowded around a crime scene, looking for the telltale signs of a witness to the event. After practicing each day to learn how to write a news story, I learned how to meet a deadline most days. Since the pay was quite small, as a clerk, I was also bartending at the time in order to pay my rent. I have said many times that almost everything bad and everything good I have learned about human behavior and how to read people has come from two places, the newsroom and the bar. My years bartending were excellent training for becoming a reporter. One's livelihood literally depends on the people they are serving drinks to. It taught me about dealing with people. I read somewhere recently that someone described the skill of a bartender as being able to make conversation. And when that runs thin, you ask a lot of questions of the person in front of you. So I learned to ask questions, even when it seemed like I had run out of ideas. I spent 6 years at the New York Post. I became a full-time reporter in 1998, and I left in 2002. During that time, I had the good fortune of working with Jack Newfield, the late muckraking reporter who had spent years at the Village Voice, holding power to account. I worked with him in what had been a signature series of his at the Village Voice called the 10 Worst Judges List. He would compile a list of jurists around the city who, for various reasons, had attracted his attention, and not in favorable ways. One was a judge who had heard a number of cases brought by one of the city's 5 district attorneys. Now, this district attorney knew Jack and called him, saying that he did not want this particular judge to be on the list. He warned Jack, if you proceed and put this person on the list, you will lose all access to this office. This made me very nervous. I had never been faced with this kind of a situation, and I did not know how we would proceed. So when I asked Jack what we should do, he said, we keep her on. You can't give in to that kind of pressure, he said. It was a lesson that was invaluable and that I have thought of many times during the last 4 years. Another lesson that I have thought of repeatedly over my time covering President Trump has been something an editor at the New York Post said to me once as I was listening to a source's concerns about a certain story and relaying to the editor. And his response was, their problems are not our problems. This is vital for people to bear in mind in a couple of different ways, but a journalist's job is not always going to be the same as an activist or a partisan or a government official. The journalist is there to do different things. But I think it takes a while for some people to learn it, and I think it is under some pressure in this current environment. When I left in October 2002 for the New York Daily News, it was perceived as a step up from the New York Post. It's not the right place for me, and I knew it fairly quickly, although I stayed there for nearly 4 years covering the John Kerry, George W. Bush race in 2004. I mention that in part because at this moment in time, President Trump has focused pretty singularly on his crowd size as a metric of voter engagement. I remember being with John Kerry in Ohio the night before the election. He had Bruce Springsteen playing. There was a crowd of what I believe was reported to be about 40,000 people. Kerry lost by, I think it was about 3 points. Crowd size is not the only way to measure the way an election could be going, especially in a general election on a presidential race. And that year taught me that, but it was something I had to see for myself. I ultimately went back to the New York Post in 2006, had a terrific 4 more years there. It was not where my career ended, even though I thought it could have been. In 2010, Politico, the Washington-based website, which at that point was, I think, 3.5, maybe 4 years old, approached me about a job. I was unexpectedly pregnant with my 3rd child. I was scared of making the leap, but I did. And I started out covering New York from there, but then I moved to covering national politics. As it turned out, in early 2011, I found out that my time at the tabloids had been invaluable because I knew and had covered advisors who were planning a possible campaign for Donald Trump that year. Again, this was 2011. Trump had been a permanent fixture at the New York tabloids, especially the Post and especially on the gossip pages. He was invariably the quote-unquote source close to Donald Trump, speaking to page 6, the gossip page, about his personal life or about who was coming and going at Trump Tower. Since I knew the characters, I had the ability to navigate the often disorienting world of Donald Trump, where there are always at least 2 factions at war and where facts are quite often seen as malleable things. I had an experience early on that year that was a reminder of that. In February 2011, I spoke to Roger Stone, Trump's longest-serving political advisor, about what a Trump presidential campaign would look like. Now, I knew that Stone was talking to Trump. I knew it from other people who were in these meetings with him. So at my editor's urging, I did an interview with Stone. And if memory serves, it was lunch at an Italian restaurant. He went on at length. He made clear he wasn't formally working for Trump, which I noted in the story. But he described a path by which Trump could win. He described the amount of money that Trump might put in himself. He insisted Trump would self-finance. He also described Trump as not wanting to work particularly hard. Going back and reading the piece recently, it was noteworthy how much of it could still have been written yesterday. The story ran with a big picture of Roger Stone in the middle. And the next day I got an email, which was a statement from Trump's office saying that Stone wasn't advising him. I had barely finished reading the email when my cell phone rang with Trump's assistant, a woman named Rona Graff, on the other end. She asked me to hold for him. He got on the phone and he informed me, Roger Stone doesn't speak for me. Now, it was totally surreal. On the one hand, I knew from other reporting that Stone was involved in this effort. And on the other, I had the would-be candidate telling me it wasn't true. As I said, it was an early window into the disorienting sensation that has become familiar for journalists seeking to cover reality during the Trump presidency, and candidly for a public trying to make sense of what they're hearing and what they're seeing. Now, Trump, of course, did not run that year. During sweeps week for The Apprentice, he announced that he would not begin a real campaign. He did 4 years later. At various points during the 2016 campaign, as I was covering these 2 people, Hillary Clinton, whose Senate race I had covered in 2000, throughout most of 2000, and Donald Trump, who I had watched and spoken to repeatedly over the years, I had a sense that Trump could win. Now, it reminded me sometimes of a sense that I had had in 2001 covering a mayor's race in which Mike Bloomberg, the billionaire media mogul and financial wizard, was running this quixotic effort for mayor. And then September 11th happened and everything changed the race. And I told a colleague that I thought Bloomberg would win the night before the election, and he informed me I was dumb. I remind him of that periodically. I went with my gut, and I believed he would win, and I was right. My gut did tell me at various points in 2016 that Donald Trump would win. I let myself get talked out of it, and that was a mistake because obviously he did win. And I should note, by the way, that in 2015, another Trump advisor, Sam Nunberg, called me in, I think it was May, maybe April 2015, and said, Trump is going to declare on June 16th, and we want you to break it. And I said, no, I am not doing this again after what happened in 2011. I felt as if he had played with us for a PR effort. That was probably not the most defensible decision in retrospect, but it was understandable at the time. Fast forward to the election, Trump obviously won. There was a perfect storm of factors that led to that win, not the least of which is that Hillary Clinton had been in the public eye for decades, and opinions were very, very firm about her in one direction or another. And if we are being honest, there was the presence of sexism, which I think certainly didn't get talked enough about at the time, and it is certainly the case and important to bear in mind looking backwards. When Trump became president, I didn't know what that was going to mean for me. I assumed I was going to cover the midterms for 2018 before he won. Instead, I became a White House reporter, and here I am. In this time, my ability to report the kind of palace intrigue stories that are the staple of tabloids and of Politico has turned out to be useful. In a White House where knowing who has the president's ear at any given moment reveals a great deal about how policy debates are shaped and won. As an example, is Peter Navarro, his economic advisor / trade advisor, winning a specific argument in his presentation as a China hawk, or is Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, winning an argument against Peter Navarro, because so much of this is personality driven with this president. Now, I have used this kind of reporting to try to explain who this president is, and that more often than not, the things he does are for simpler reasons than it appears. I think there has been an effort to try to impute this three-dimensional chess on everything he does, that everything has to be a distraction, and people spend lots of time trying to figure out what it is he could be distracting from. And often he is just reacting. There was a great line in a Politico piece that my former colleague Ashley Parker and I have talked about repeatedly, where Trump, a former Trump advisor, said something to the effect of, people want to think that he's playing chess, but more often than not, he's eating the pieces. And so that's where we are. Throughout 2016, as I said, most of us wrote that Donald Trump would not win, most likely, especially those of us in New York City who knew him as a C-list real estate broker whose past was littered with casino bankruptcies and failures that would have stung most people, but that did not sting him deeply because he didn't see them as failures. What we didn't realize was that most of the country knew him from The Apprentice, where he had played the character of a successful businessman who gleefully fired people. Now, that veneer of running a meeting, of sitting in a high-back leather chair, was so durable for people that it would stun me when I would cover the caucuses in Iowa in their final days in January 2016. And I would ask people questions at rallies that I acknowledge were leading, saying, are you here because this is the last time you will see Donald Trump? And they would look at me like I had 8 heads and say, no, I'm going to caucus for him. And when I would ask them why, they would say, because I watched him run his business, he was very successful. Now, no matter how many times we wrote the reality of Donald Trump's business experience in real estate, it ran counter to what people thought they knew from watching him. And I have thought a lot about this since, something that Roger Stone once said to me, which is that the line between news and entertainment for most people who are not in the news business and are simply consumers of both is much blurrier than we realize. I think it has taken 4 years of the country seeing Donald Trump to understand him, to understand who he is. Now, I think the fact that we are dealing with trying to establish as journalists what the truth is, that has become much harder as a task in this White House. This White House does not do what most political entities do, what most offices of an elected official do, which is spin, shade facts. Instead, this White House tells repeated falsehoods and misrepresents facts. We see it from the president himself. We see it from the White House press secretary. That has sometimes impeded our baseline search for facts and made it harder to know, essentially, where is the level, where is the line where things begin and where they end. It has been vitally important for myself, for my colleagues, to try to find the truth, to try to learn as much as possible about this president, and to, I think, explain to the public who he is. Now, he spends a lot of time complaining that stories are negative or coverage is negative, but the reality is that we're often just writing about a set of facts that might not be great for him, but that are objectively true. That's the case with impeachment. That was the case with the Mueller investigation. But this president sees covering him accurately in general as covering him unfairly. I want to talk a bit about what the presidency under another Trump term could look like, as well as what a Biden first 100 days or first 6 months could look like. There are significant questions that remain, and I'll start with Biden, about what the first 100 days of a Biden administration would look like. We know that his very first priority would be dealing with the pandemic. Now, that would involve, I think, based on what he has said, trying to come up with some kind of a national mask mandate. He has obviously tried to model best practices about masks that is contrary to what President Trump has done. There's a limit to how a national mask mandate can actually work. He does not have the power, any president, to influence states to make them do this, but he could mandate it on federal land or in federal buildings, and even that would be a change from what we have seen. After that, there is the question of another stimulus package, assuming that nothing gets done in the lame duck session of Congress after the election, then it would move into next year. And whether something would be possible will depend in part on what the composition of the Senate looks like. We talk a lot about the presidential race, but the reality is that the control of the Senate is very much in play right now, and it is something of a knife's edge, short of the bottom dropping out for Republicans. It could end up with a majority of just one seat, or it could end up 50-50. And so I think all of that is going to complicate what Joe Biden could do. He has also said that he will roll back a lot of President Trump's immigration measures. In many cases, these are anti-immigrant measures. I think that among the priorities that he would deal with is rolling back the end of DACA, which was litigated in court for roughly 2 years, maybe even over 2 years, and which basically the administration has punted on after the Supreme Court said that they ended it illegally, but did not rule on whether the program itself was legal. Since it was started under President Obama, I think we can assume that it would be reinstated under Joe Biden. But again, whether he would try for an effort at a comprehensive immigration bill, that will depend on what the Senate will look like. Joe Biden is a former member of the Senate. He is somebody with a deep series of relationships. I'm not sure that those relationships with Republicans that he had prior to becoming the vice president, and even while he was the vice president, will hold as well in a post-Trump era, where everything is so tribal and so partisan and so divided by who your friends are and what jersey you're wearing. Climate change, another area where I think that you will see Joe Biden try to move immediately to undo measures that this president has done, either by reinstituting regulations that were repealed by President Trump or instituting new ones. This president has been very open to coal and maintaining the presence of coal energy. I think that Joe Biden would have a very different approach. Those are some of the major areas. And then there's more broadly the economy, where I think that Biden would try to undo the tax cuts that the president put in place in 2017. But what that ends up looking like, I think will remain to be seen. The second term of a President Trump administration, I think, is a big open question. Now, there is a world where President Trump, if the Senate flips over to Democrats, where this president suddenly sees himself in a different atmosphere and tries to make deals and tries to get something done or work toward agreements. But that's not something that comes naturally to this president. And what he has tended to do is be angry and look for retribution to people who were opposed to him. I think it is very likely that you will see him fire a number of cabinet officials. Not unusual to change cabinet officials in a second term, but I think the way in which this president might go about it would be very different. I think you can guarantee that the FBI director is likely to be fired regardless of who wins soon after Election Day. I think that the president is likely to fire the Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, regardless of whether he wins after Election Day. I think you will see the Education Secretary leave in a second administration. Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, will leave. I think there are a number of these roles. And then there's the question of what happens if President Trump loses. Will we know on election night? Will we know who won on Tuesday? Will this drag on for several days? Are news outlets going to be able to resist, and I hope they do, making premature calls on who might have won on Tuesday based on in-person voting that day when all of the votes are not necessarily counted in various states? Let's say that Joe Biden wins. President Trump has 3 months to do certain things on policy, to try to nestle his allies into positions within the government, throughout the government, to try to have loyalists in what he has often derisively referred to as the deep state. He has 3 months to try to make a transition very difficult for Joe Biden, and something that I think will be on the president's mind throughout all of this, should he lose, are these looming prosecutions that he is facing. We know of an effort by the Manhattan District Attorney, Cy Vance, who has gone to the Supreme Court to get the president's tax returns, and that has been a battle even still after the Supreme Court kicked it back to a lower court. We know that the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, is investigating the Trump Organization. I think that protecting his personal brand and trying to find a way to avoid prosecution is something that the president will be thinking about should he lose. I also think, if I'm suggesting that people watch what's going to happen in the next 3 months, does the president pardon a lot of people? Does he pardon people by bypassing the pardon process, the normal pardon process, which he's done several times already? Does he pardon a series of allies, as he's also done already? We have already faced historic tumult in the last 4 years, and certainly in this year. My warning to people is that it's probably going to go on a little bit longer. My on the bright side warning to people comes from my colleague Alex Burns, who actually said this on a panel we were on for the Times earlier about the election, which is this has also been a year of intense and impressive civic engagement, from protests about systemic racism, from protests against egregious police abuses that began in May and continued on for months, and which in many ways were continuations of previous Black Lives Matter protests going on for years at this point, but finally getting mainstream attention, and by the number of people who are turning out to vote. Now, it is true that long voting lines can be a form of voter suppression, and certainly in New York City, the election system, despite the fact that there's a very large Democratic voter edge, there's still factions within Democrats, and these long lines do convince some people not to stay in line and vote. But a lot of people are waiting in line for hours to vote. This is a level of engagement that should be encouraging about the degree to which citizens are participating in the process. I think with that, I would like to turn it over to questions.
Maggie, what a fascinating analysis. I have so many questions. And we're going to get to a lot of them. So also, I know audience, you've seen a tracker come out, and here it is. We'd love to hear from you. So submit your questions. They're getting fed to me, and I'll ask as many as I can to our guest. So Maggie, I actually want to kick off with sort of a 10,000-foot question. And this was submitted by one of our audience members in advance of the talk. So thank you to whoever did this. So she asks, what role do journalists play in shaping the public's perception of public policies and political figures? So what role do journalists play in shaping the public's perception of public policies? It's an important
question, and I guess what I would say is that the role that journalists play has shifted somewhat over time, in that it is no longer that there are a series of national broadsheets, right? There's no longer USA Today, the New York Times, Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the LA Times. There is something of a choose your own adventure news cycle that people participate in. And so increasingly, people are getting news that mirrors the views they already have or what they want to be told. Candidly, this concerns me. While I'm very much in favor of a variety of news sources, they're not all the same. Part of the problem is that a lot of people go to Twitter for easy search of news, and everything looks the same there. In its best possible distillation, reporters play a role by explaining what actions their government could be taking, what the impact is on actual citizens, and does not turn it into a parlor game. The problem, as I said before, is that often policy in this administration is made as a parlor game. It is made as something of a Game of Thrones interaction in the Oval Office with the president and a bunch of advisors. And one person wins and several others lose, or two people win and several people lose. So the role of journalists, I think that not everybody has the same perspective on this. I think there are people who think that journalists ought to advocate for certain policy outcomes. There are people who think that journalists should be more vocal than I think straight news reporters really should be in trying to advocate outcomes. I think one of the things that struck me in 2016 and its aftermath was, I think that all of us in the media, not all of us, many of us in the media, and myself included at that time, really didn't realize how much even well-read consumers of news saw the news gathering process and production process as very opaque. So I'm hoping my question answers it a little bit. I realize there's probably a bunch of different questions, but I think there are different ways that journalists can approach informing the public of certain policy decisions or possibilities. One thing I think, and last point I'll make on this, that the New York Times has been very good about is doing visual journalism to try to explain policy to people. I think it's been tremendous.
I've really enjoyed some of the infographics. I think, yeah, they're really terrific stuff.
I'm glad to hear it.
We have another audience question that came in early, and that is, of all the stories that you have covered during your President Trump time in office, or maybe even go back in time, because I didn't know your history with President Trump, what's one that you find most memorable?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think the one that I find most memorable is that's just about him, is a story that I did about him the day after the Access Hollywood tape. For those of you who don't remember, October 7th, 2016, the Washington Post reported the existence of unedited and unused video of President Trump, then businessman Trump, talking to Billy Bush, the host of Access Hollywood, and saying really vile things about women, and describing himself sexually assaulting women. And it was a really jarring tape, and it shook up the race. It was also the same day that right after that tape came out that the WikiLeaks emails from the Clinton hacks started dropping on their site, which was clearly designed to try to draw attention away, or appear to be designed to draw attention away from the Billy Bush tape. But I did a story the next day while President Trump was holed up at Trump Tower, and the world was just swirling around him. He was getting nudges to drop out of the race, some nudges, some not nudges. He was basically alone up there with his family, with Kellyanne Conway, who at the time was the campaign manager, and nothing but news reports that were just sort of the worst thing that he could possibly hear about himself. Because I will tell you, it's the one time that I can remember him being embarrassed. He doesn't really easily get embarrassed, but he really was embarrassed, and had some level of shame that you don't normally see with him, and was wounded. And in that sense of being wounded, he came downstairs at Trump Tower, and there were a couple of us who were staked out in the lobby. The lobby, I should tell you, of Trump Tower is actually public property, which is a whole thing that he worked out with the city 30 years ago when he built it 35 years ago. He came downstairs because outside of the gold-gilded doors, about 100 Trump supporters had gathered on Fifth Avenue. And he came downstairs. We had no warning he was coming. He clearly wasn't coming for us. He had Kellyanne Conway on his, I think it was his right, and he had his son, Don Jr., on his left. And Trump walked into the crowd through, I believe, through the revolving door. I got stuck inside momentarily and was able to get out to get through. People were touching him. They were reaching out to touch his coat. And he put his hand up in the air in a fist pump at one point. And then he went back inside and he was applauding for himself, going like this, which you see him do sometimes at rallies. It was a really jarring moment because I felt like he was capable of anything in that moment. And I can't really explain why that was the sense, but it was. But that's one of the stories that I've written about him that stands out to me the most.
Let me follow up on that because he seems to get, President Trump seems to get a different level of attention and vigor from his interactions with the public and large crowds in particular. And it sort of builds off what you were just saying. When you think back of other campaigns that you've covered, is it different, or is this just a normal politician kind of getting riled up by his supporters?
No, he's not. It's just not the same thing. I mean, the possibly the most comparable person I could think of is Bill Clinton, who liked talking to people this much, but Bill Clinton's approach was obviously very different. Trump feeds off of and needs attention in a different way. Bill Clinton likes interacting with people, likes being noticed, likes talking to people. Donald Trump in the 80s used to, when he was becoming famous, would walk up to people and sort of stop in front of them and see if they recognized him. That's very different than a normal, typical politician. And he needs it. He needs the crowd adulation in a different way. I think the part, other than riding on Air Force One and living in the White House and being called Mr. President, I think the part he has loved about all of this remains holding these rallies.
We're getting a question, and I have from Ryan in our audience. And Ryan asks, how will the election projections made by the media organizations differ this year, in particular compared to 2016?
It's a great question. It's a really great question. The short answer is that I don't know specifically. I can't give you guidance right now on what it will look like, other than the fact that I think that everybody is mindful of not having another Florida 2000, right? I don't think that people want to give a call when it is too early. I think the fear for a lot of news outlets, frankly, is that Trump is going to come out, and this is also a concern of Democrats. It concerns us for a different reason, which is just the coverage challenge. But the concern is that Trump will come out and say, I won, when the results have not been called yet. Typically, again, the way this usually happens is news outlets wait for a state to be called. In general, the Associated Press is the standard. And we usually wait for them. They call it, and we all usually wait for them. They call it, and then the race is eventually, when it's critical mass, called for one person or another, and then the loser calls the winner to concede. Now, Hillary Clinton did call Donald Trump on election night. I don't know what we're going to be looking at going into next week, assuming that we have a winner next week. Donald Trump's best hope, short of an outright victory on election night, is to be able to drag it out and keep punching against the vote being certified and the election being certified. So the long answer is also I don't know, other than that I think that we are all very aware of having restraint.
You talked a little bit about what you think the next couple months might look like, either Biden administration or with the President Trump administration. I want to follow up on some of your observations on what President Trump might do post, let's say he does not win. What do you see for him in the next 6 months, 1 year? What's the career path for former President Donald Trump, if that is what happens after Election Day?
So this is an excellent question. It's something I talk about a lot with people. I think that the president will be extremely concerned about protecting his business brand and about these investigations, as I mentioned. there is a non-zero chance, I'm not saying that this will happen, but it could happen, that he announces that he's running for president again in 2024. That would allow him to keep raising money to pay for various things, and that would allow him to keep holding rallies, which he wants to do. I think then the question becomes, how does the media treat an ex-president who is sort of running a permanent campaign going back to 2015? It would upend the Republican Party because you already see candidates, Tom Cotton, others getting out there and possibly running. It would just be very different. But what I see for him is not leaving the spotlight. There's also a world where he could try to buy a media property. I think that's going to be a little harder than people think it would be. But these are the various lanes I see. In a world where there's no investigations, and in a world where he doesn't have sort of an angry reaction to a loss, which I think is likely if he loses, you could see him recognizing that he has the ability to be a kingmaker, and that how he leaves office will be important for trying to preserve his brand going forward. But we'll see if that's an argument that people make to him and if that's an argument that he accepts.
We have a number of our audience members excited about your gut reactions, and thinking back to your talk and saying you had this kind of strong gut that President Trump might win, and you didn't speak out. So
I didn't speak out. I didn't succeed, but yes, I did speak out.
Very good. Ashling from our audience, he asks, do you have a gut feeling about this election like you did in 2016?
I wouldn't say, just because I'm really not in the prediction business, and I wasn't then either. If you look at the polling trends, if you look at the Real Clear Politics averages for the national polling, which is a little meaningless right now, just in terms of how states vote, Joe Biden's average is actually pretty similar to what President Obama's was over John McCain in 2016. A Democratic strategist was pointing this out to me earlier. Now, it doesn't mean it's the same type of 7-point average, but Biden's lead has been pretty durable, and it's been durable for a long time. I think there are reasons the Democrats feel very good about their chances heading into Tuesday. I do think Donald Trump has a path. I think it is narrow, and I think it requires a lot of different factors to fall into place. But I don't think anybody should say, yes, he definitely won't win.
So many people think that if he has a path, they would have to come through here. I'm sitting in Madison, Wisconsin.
Right.
I think most of our audience members are from Madison, Wisconsin, although I think there's about 26 states represented here tonight.
Oh, wow.
So Ashley from Wisconsin asks you, how do you think Trump's appeal to Wisconsinite has changed since 2016, if at all?
I don't think it's changed at all. I think Donald Trump has a very much one-size-fits-all approach. If you watch these rallies, they are identical. There is sort of these are not states that are particularly receptive to him. In general, these are not states that he won by large margins. Certainly, I think that once upon a time his team felt pretty okay about Wisconsin. I think that changed dramatically in the last year. And I think the fact that he keeps showing up or talking about the state and ignoring the fact that there is a spike in coronavirus cases, I don't think helps him. There are many people who are not voting with the coronavirus as their top issue, but there are many people who are, and people who are living through it and being impacted by it. And when your attitude in every state you're in is to say, COVID, 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 this is all the news wants to talk about, I don't know that wins you votes, but I don't see his approach to Wisconsin as any different than it is to every other state. He talks about, certain pieces of pork that he can point to. He talks about things that he thinks he did for the state. And the implicit message is always, and therefore you should support me. He tends to say the inside part quite out loud. But I don't think that he has changed his approach at all, other than that in general, his approach is to drive up support among white voters, particularly white, non-college educated men. And I think that approach holds through aspects of the Midwest.
So I want to change things up. This was another question submitted in advance of the talk tonight. Many people long for a return to bipartisan conversations and solutions within government. Is there a role for the media to play in creating and nurturing a bipartisan approach to governing?
No, I don't actually think there is a role for the media to do that. I think that I think that partisanship has been increasing since the 1990s, since the Clinton era, and that was, deep opposition to Bill Clinton from the Gingrich-led House of Representatives, the Republican majority then, and it's just continued. After that time, you had a contested election in 2000. There was a devastating terrorist attack on three cities or three locations. There were two wars in the Mideast. There was a bitter re-election in 2004. There was a fiscal crisis. There are a lot of reasons that the country is as divided as it is right now. I think the media's job is to report. Now, I think there are columnists who will voice opinions and voice a desire for a bipartisan atmosphere. But I've got to say, most columnists, certainly not, or a number of them anyway, at the Times and at the Washington Post, speak very longingly for the era when, John McCain and Joe Biden were able to work together. It's not as if people are not talking about the rewards of bipartisanship. I think in both parties, but particularly among Republicans and among conservatives, there is this media ecosystem that rewards extreme partisanship. So, and that media ecosystem, as much as it's not the mainstream media, is still the media. So until that changes, I think maybe the role that the media would play is to, spend less time elevating people who are just sort of doing partisan attacks on somebody else. But I think that we are well beyond that. In general, I think the role of the mainstream media reporters is simply to report.
With a whole buzz of questions about this kind of topic, so you're touching a chord with a lot of people.
Okay.
So Ryan on our audience wants to ask about, how do you keep this unbiased approach when you cover a president who repeatedly attacks the media and the press? So how do you live that value that you shared?
You do it. I mean, I have gotten good at putting aside my whatever in order to be fair and in order to give a hearing to people who are coming to me. The basic way that I approach my job is I will either start out covering something that's happening in the world, or I will hear about something and I will start trying to report it out. But I'm always open to, and frankly I want someone to talk me out of why what I think or believe might be happening isn't happening. What I want to do is be able to give somebody a hearing. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to just take what they say and throw it into the paper. There are times that people will say things to us that are simply not true in the course of wanting to get a hearing. But that's my role. Look, the president has obviously leveled unprecedented attacks, at least for this last 100 years, on the mainstream press with the megaphone that he has, and in this era of media amplification. He's not the first. I'm not excusing in any way what he does, because what he has done has enabled autocrats and dictators elsewhere in the world by calling us the enemy of the people and the fake news and whatever else. He is a grossly exaggerated version of ref working, which is what typical politicians do. Hillary Clinton worked the ref. Bill Clinton worked the ref. Joe Biden works the ref. Rudy Giuliani, when he was mayor and I was covering him, would scream at us, almost every day. Jerky question, that's ridiculous. But he never called us fake. He did call people biased. He did say things like that. Mike Bloomberg, who owns a media outlet, referred to a current colleague of mine when he was at another outlet back when he was covering Bloomberg as mayor as a disgrace at the end of a press conference. So certainly in volume, frequency, and intensity, this is different. But he is not the first politician in history to say terrible things about the media. And we still have to do our job throughout.
So consistency, at least, amongst
right. Right, exactly. We've seen this before. I mean, we haven't seen this before, but we've seen where it comes from before.
Well, I love that, unfettering the truth, right? I mean, that is such a wonderful, noble value. I feel like it's part of academia as well. It's one of the things that drove me to my job, and I can see it in your drive as well. It's really wonderful.
And to be clear, I don't think I do it perfectly. I don't think I've done it perfectly. I have had errors in stories. I have found out new information that has changed how we do something. But that is my goal. So.
So we have another audience member who is asking you to think back again, your covering of President Trump, and point to something you really enjoyed about the time covering the Trump administration.
Boy, that's quite a question. So the thing that I have enjoyed the most, other than just it is a privilege to cover the White House. So I'll answer that in a few parts. It's a privilege to cover the White House. It is even more of a privilege to be able, candidly, to do it from New York, which if Joe Biden became president, I would not be able to do. There wouldn't be a need for it. It'd be very different. I was literally one of the only people on our team who knew anybody coming into the new administration when he won and was in his transition, he being Trump. So there's just that generally. It is thrilling to ride on Air Force One the first time that you do that. I think that, look, I have covered things that, as I was just looking back on the last 3 years of some of the stories, and most of this you couldn't have written as a movie script. I feel privileged to have been a part of it. I think my favorite part of this overall has been getting to work with Mike Schmidt, my colleague who I did much of the Mueller investigation reporting with, and another colleague, Mark Mazzetti, and Adam Goldman. I mean, that has been one of the joys. And I think that my favorite story that I have done since he became president, there were two, actually, and they were both this year. They're very different. One was about the president repeatedly using his assault on transgender rights as a wedge within the LGBT community. And the other was when Mike Schmidt and I broke the story about what was in John Bolton's book during the impeachment trial. And there was a moment where it looked as if they were going to have to call witnesses. They ultimately didn't. But behind me is something that Mike Schmidt got me, which is a framed, the framed front page of ours from that day, but also the Wall Street Journal and the Post, which were never able to match the story and had to credit us. So those are my favorite moments.
Journalists are competitive too.
We are, yes.
So we have a question from one of our audience members, David. So David asks, can you shed light on the fact that many of President Trump's policies, David lists the trade wars, taxes, ACA, seem to hurt many of his core supporters disproportionately, yet his core supporters seem so unshakable. So can you comment on that?
It's an excellent question, a really important question, and one I wish that I had gotten to in my talk. I don't think I can shed light on it beyond the fact that he's got this core group of supporters who feel as if he listens to them, and they feel as if he is just different than everything they have seen out of Washington, and who don't believe, that he is doing something that harms them, or that harms them, that the harm is worth absorbing because he's doing something else that helps them. It's in line with what I was saying before about this kind of mythology he created among people sitting in the high back leather chair on The Apprentice, that he was, leaderly and presidential. They wouldn't believe what they were hearing otherwise. So I think he has a core group of people who, many of whom consume information from Fox News or from conservative media sources, and who believe that he is fighting for them. And so they believe that they are willing to absorb the pain of these trade wars because there's some end goal. Now, clearly his trade wars have harmed other policy accomplishments of his, like the tax cuts, The trade war ran counter to that. And a lot of his, and putting tariffs on goods ran counter to that. Some of his advisors pleaded with him to understand that, and he just wouldn't. But it has not moved this core of support that he has, at least so far. We will find out if that's still true on Tuesday.
So we have a question from an audience member that asks, so what's something about President Trump that most people don't know about him?
Most people don't know this. This is not a novel thing to say, but people don't really, I think, know this or accept this, but there are plenty of people around him who will tell you this. He's a very lonely person. To your question before about the needing the engagement and is that just a sort of an exaggerated version of another politician or other types of politicians? No, I mean he is constantly searching for someone to talk to. Why do you think he likes talking to the press so much? It's not just about wanting to see his name in the paper. Yes, he likes that, but he is constantly looking for someone to talk to and pay attention to him.
Are there certain topics that you ask about or your colleagues ask about that he just really never wants to talk about? It's another audience question.
It's funny. There are certain things that he gives vaguely different answers to sometimes. He doesn't really like talking about anything that could be perceived as weakness, right? So um, when, so for instance, he had a friend named Stanley Shira who died of the coronavirus. He was a real estate magnate in New York. And the president called Shira's, I think either family or Shira himself every day in the hospital when he was there for like 2 weeks in the spring. And that's not something that the president would actually talk about because as much as we think of politicians wanting to be humanized, Trump doesn't actually want to be humanized. He doesn't want anything that would be perceived as weak unless he authorizes it, in which case that's okay. He doesn't really like talking about his family. He doesn't like talking about the first lady other than sort of the generalities that you hear. He talks a lot and you can almost lose track of the fact that he's not really saying much at all.
So I think I only have time for this one last question. And this is from Atya. And Atya asks, has your approach to journalism changed since 2016 with the increase of attacks on and the skepticism on the press?
It's a good question. I think that what we have done differently, I would say, and this is answering your question a little bit differently than how you asked it, but what we have tried to do and how we cover Trump differently is, it used to be that we would say what he said and then we would put that it was not true in the second graph, and then the third graph would be what the real fact was. Now, then it became in the lead. We would say he falsely said. Now it's in the headline. So, I think we're trying to make clear to people and not just repeat things that he says. In terms of skepticism, look, when you have a president telling people, don't believe anything other than what you hear from me, essentially, and I'm summarizing, but that is basically what he's saying, that's a real challenge. It's not as if he created skepticism in the media. We have clearly done enough to harm ourselves over the years, but he pours gasoline on that. And so I think what we have tried to do is make sure that stories, and it's not that we didn't do this before, we did, but we try to make sure the stories are as bulletproof as possible because we know that any minor fact, and again, this is not just new to him, this is other politicians have done this too, but any small thing they can seize on, they will use it to pull the whole thing apart. And so I think we are mindful that we are existing in a world of bad faith actors. But I don't know how to solve media skepticism. It worries me greatly about what the future looks like.
Something to watch for our next
Correct.
journalists and residents. Maggie Haberman, thank you for this hour. This has been fabulous. As everybody knows, you more than anyone, we're less than a week out from this election.
5 days.
5 days. And it's going to be an important one, both for politics, policy, and for governance.
It is.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us today. So, thank you to all the audience members who are here. I want to acknowledge that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of questions that we didn't get to. We didn't get a chance to share with Maggie, and I want to thank you for those questions in advance and just say we apologize that we didn't get to them. I also want to share with you another event that the La Follette School is putting on in the very near future, building on a book my colleague Dennis Driesing has written about former Governor Patrick Lucey, thinking back to his lasting legacy. We're also going to have former governors Jim Doyle and Scott McCallum on this panel on November 12th at 7 p.m., all reflecting on being a governor and governance here in Wisconsin. I think it's going to be a great event. There's going to be opportunities to join that event for free, obviously, and you can see the website here. I hope you do join us. And Maggie Haberman, one last time, thank you for being with us at the La Follette School of Public Affairs and UW-Madison. We're sure glad your mom is a Badger.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me. This was a treat.
And good luck over the next week and we want to cheer you on in your journalist endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you.